All right, folks, we'll go ahead and get started. Once again, welcome to Microdesk Practical Strategies for Streamlining Cloud Services. My name is Jasenia. I am the event coordinator here at Microdesk. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please be sure you're typing them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel, not in the chat panel. We'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar. Also, a recorded version of this webinar will be available on our website and YouTube channel within a couple of days. You'll be receiving an email with a link once that's available. And before we jump into the webinar, I would like to introduce Microdesk to you all. Sorry, folks, 1 second. So Microdesk was founded in 1994 as an Autodesk reseller with a simple mission: to assist architecture, engineering, construction owners, and GIS firms with improving workflows and integrating project delivery technologies. 25 years later, that mission still holds true. Microdesk is a well-established AECO consulting firm with 13 offices in the US and UK. We have over 230 AECO consultants, solution specialists, and software developers that can help in all sectors, all disciplines, and at all stages. Some of the hottest topics in the AECO world are globalization, urbanization, and sustainability. Urbanization studies suggest that the US will build 114 cities the size of Boston in the next 30 years. Here at Microdesk, we can help to make sure you're prepared to meet those demands. We use software from industry leaders and combine it with our vision and passion for sustainability to meet the demands of urbanization. Our team of industry expert consultants are redefining project delivery and asset management. We're committed to helping clients realize the business benefits of BIM quickly and economically by facilitating the use of innovative technologies and processes. Whether it's streamlining your design, construction, or operations, our consulting team is the nation's largest and most experienced group of AECO technology consulting professionals. To help support the industry with these demands of urbanization, we offer full service consulting. This includes project coordinating services, BIM and CIM content development, asset management, CIO advisory, and much, much more. We partner with world leaders such as Autodesk, IBM, and Panzora to utilize innovative technologies and methodologies to empower sustainable design and overcome local challenges. Our vision is to reduce the environmental impact of urbanization by helping the AECO industry to design, construct, and operate better projects more efficiently by leveraging the full potential of BIM, VDC, and asset management. Now, Brad Horst will jump on to take you through today's webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jasenia, and thanks to everybody for joining the call. I know that everybody probably has webinar overload at this point, or webinar fatigue, as the phrase is increasingly referred to as. And it's no different for me, but regardless, I think this is increasingly an important topic that I'm running into time and time again, and so I thought that this was an opportunity to maybe share some insights and some some of the conversations that we're having on a pretty regular basis these days. Again, my name is Brad Horst. I'm from the industry side of the equation, trained as an architect, and this gives you kind of a listing of some of my experiences over the years. Prior to joining Microdesk, most recently I was a CIO for EYP Architecture and Engineering for the last 10 years, but had numerous other positions prior to that, including, oddly enough, I was the product marketing manager for Revit for 3 years while at Autodesk, which was kind of a life-changing experience, I have to say. But in any case, I love the industry and I love technology, and it's a great place if you guys are in the technology field, which I assume you are, or at least related to it. It's a pretty exciting time to be in this part of the business. Let's see if I can forward here. Give me 1 second here. I don't have control here. There we go. So just a quick note about what we call CIO Advisory Services. This is really the main reason I joined Microdesk. Formerly, I was a customer as well, like some of you. And Yeah, I really looked at Microdesk historically as kind of a license, group where I could buy licenses from for Autodesk products. But the more I started talking with them, the more I realized that almost an equal part, if not slightly leading part of the business these days, is actually consulting services. But oddly enough, consulting up until this group was joined was really focused on the project side of the equation, specifically with design technologies, analysis tools, asset management tools for managing businesses and so forth, or projects and so forth. So there was an opportunity to actually kind of complete that IT problem-solving equation by introducing advisory services, and we kind of look at it in sort of three buckets, generally speaking. Without going into all the details here, on the left side where we title it kind of the learn category, it's really about trying to help people with the operational side of IT, trying to carve out time for people to learn more on a more regular basis, improve their skills, move to cloud services, move to digital, all that type of thing, versus the middle section, which is really about empowering project teams, empowering employees. A lot of that has to do with, again, move to cloud and move to mobile initiatives, process improvement, trying to make things as self-service as possible. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And then finally, on the accelerate and deliver side, that's where you might think of it more from a strategic standpoint in terms of how IT maps with the business and supports the business and helps to accelerate or amplify what the owners and stakeholders in the firm are really trying to do as a company. So we try to hit all of those different buckets to create kind of a complete offering in addition to what Microdesk is well known for, so that when there are problems or solutions that you're looking for, it's not about us saying it's not our problem, right? If you run into a networking issue or a server issue or a design apps issue, it's really about trying to deal with all of that holistically in terms of the solutions and different offerings that we have to provide. So today, back to the agenda here. These are the types of things that we're going to look at in a little bit more detail, and I don't think this will actually take a whole hour. It's fairly quick, I think, and I'll try not to try to keep it high level. But I think it's worth glossing over a couple of these ideas just because they continue to surface, at least in discussions that I'm having with customers on a daily basis. So you might think about platform. We talked about platform a little bit in terms of CIO Advisory Services and Microdesk services. Well, on the application side, it's kind of the same idea where platform really has to do with a bunch of services or a collection of services and applications. And increasingly, I think the action is, frankly, around platform offerings. That might be called literally cloud services, or it might be products that are offered by a particular vendor or provider that are just naturally designed to work together. So there's a lot of advantages to that, but you can see some examples here. Microsoft Office 365 is a common thing. You might be a G Suite shop if you're a Google shop. On the design side, it might be BIM 360 or Bentley's applications or Nemetschek or somebody like that. I will say, by the way, that the CIO Advisory Services is actually an agnostic IT group. So I tend to talk about our partners as well as other partners and players in the industry as well, because I think it's, we're really trying to focus on solutions. With regard to graphics and storytelling, you might be an affinity shop or maybe an open source shop if it's open source tools or Adobe Creative Cloud or something like that. Same thing with Bluebeam and Acrobat for drawing and markup. Again, BIM 360 could be in that category as well. The PlanGrid, Nuform, or Procore on the project information management side. And this is just a small selection, as you guys know. It's not, it might, in my previous role at EYP, where I was the CIO, we probably had a good couple hundred applications that we were managing across both the architecture and engineering discipline groups. So there's a lot of tools, but I think one of the themes throughout all of these different topics is going to be that as at least my realization was that as the workforce becomes more distributed and more complicated, it's even more important that you seek out services that are actually centralized from a management standpoint and simplified. So it's actually kind of the opposite, what you're looking for given what you're faced with, I guess is how I look at it. And certainly the platform players do a lot of that work for you, which is nice if it works for you. So I would always start with sort of the platform, the big platforms, because whether it's Microsoft, Autodesk, Adobe, or somebody else, if they're the leaders in the industry, not only are they going to probably have the biggest budgets for development, but when they build integration between themselves, they're going to look to probably the leaders in the industry first, because that's where it's going to have the greatest impact from a user standpoint. That's not to say that down the road other integrations won't happen, but I think certainly out of the gate, they in my experience, they tend to flow towards where the greatest user populations are. So something to keep in mind. Single sign-on is kind of a nice feature set inside of a lot of the cloud services these days, especially the more mature ones. And often something like single sign-on is something today that might not be available in the free version of software, but as you get into the paid versions of different platform services or cloud services, then capabilities like single sign-on become offerings. When you're looking at single sign-on, certainly SAML is a big standard in the industry that is worth kind of checking in on. If they're most often cloud services themselves. So centralized access control is sort of inherent. It gives you kind of a change anywhere sort of way of managing operations, which is great. You don't have to track down those changes, when things happen or people come and go in the firm. And again, when I say integrated versus third party, integrated might be something like Active Directory or Azure Active Directory versus a third party like Ping or Okta or OneLogin or something like that. Again, you just have to look at what the offering is, what the best fit is for you. If obviously you're probably not going to use Azure Active Directory if you're a Google shop, right? So then you might look at a third party single sign-on solution as an example. But I would just look carefully at how they set up in your organization, how many apps out of the gate you can kind of bring into the fold, right? Because odds are if you have 100 or 200 applications, they're not all going to be single sign-on ready today. So introducing a single sign-on program is going to be something that probably happens a little bit over time, unless you have a very small group of applications or platforms that you're working with and they're really industry leaders already today. So anyhow, that's kind of some thoughts on single sign-on. I actually like it quite a lot from a security standpoint, from a management standpoint, but at the end of the day, the big win for me, at least on single sign-on, is that users remember one username and password, not multiples. And as you guys probably all know, every new cloud service that you introduce is going to have its own username and password unless it's single sign-on capable, and you can weave it right into another authentication or identity management system that you already have in place. Enterprise security, I touched on that a little bit with single sign-on, but again, the big platform players probably have much more robust security infrastructures than some of the newer players in the industry, and you can kind of guess which ones are a little bit more mature than others, even though the good thing that I see happening is that with the major players, you're starting to see some commonality between feature sets and how things work and what they've agreed on to provide or not provide. So that's all good, because that lays the groundwork for kind of the mid-tier and maybe the smaller groups that are just entering the field to kind of develop around some of those quote unquote standards that the big players that were early entries into the space have started to establish. But from a security standpoint, again, today I think I was actually the CISO at EYP Architecture and Engineering as well as the CIO, but that I wouldn't say that I'm really a deep down in the weeds security guy necessarily, but I tended to work mostly on security from a project standpoint. We had sectors like energy sectors and healthcare sectors and government sector work, and all of those had kind of their own security. So it was important, security requirements. So it was important to know really what was happening in terms of access when people come and go. What do you have to change to make sure that that change of them leaving or coming populates throughout the system? Multi-factor was increasingly expected, right? An expectation for those types of groups. And the other big challenge with security is that there's probably, there's literally hundreds of security applications out there, and the challenge is to find this. I would say, again, the big platform players I would always start with, at least to kind of evaluate. But how do you get visibility and day-to-day control into the whatever security application suite you're looking for? So again, that sort of bodes well for the larger players because they have a lot of that visibility and control built in across kind of a broader set of features and applications within their platform. So that's another kind of reason why I tend to start with big players like that. Encryption in transit versus at state, that's often a big requirement that you'll see. And again, it's just a matter of reading through the different security and hosting solutions that you're looking at, the file management solutions and so forth. Take something like Panzura or Nasuni or some of the others out there. Falcon, I think, is another one. So I think probably all of them have kind of statements about encryption, whether it's in transit or at state. But in the case of Panzura, which I'm most familiar with, just because they are a partner of ours, right? They kind of check that box very easily, right? It's very high levels of encryption that are NIST compliant and FedRAMP compliant, and all these different kinds of compliances that certain project types might require. Again, something to kind of check against when you're considering enterprise security solutions. And then, of course, SIM integration, whether you have kind of an aggregation system that brings in, I almost said breathes in, which it kind of does that, but it brings in log files from a lot of different systems and creates visibility into what's going on from an activity and behavior standpoint. As you're thinking about different security components, if you have a SIM or if you're thinking about a SIM, it's worthwhile to see, to kind of evaluate whether or not it's going to fit neatly into your other component that you already have in place. So it's again, it's no longer, in my view, about necessarily focusing on individual applications. It's really looking at the architecture or the structure of the entire environment to try to do everything that you can to simplify along the way, to make it easy for the user side, and to make sure you're complying with what the business actually needs. Centralized purchasing, this is one that came to mind as a result of Autodesk's new offering around subscription premium services, especially in larger organizations, those that have offices inside and outside of the country. It's always been a challenge with territory rates and things like that in terms of how you manage and acquire software, how you update it and so forth. So, there are programs certainly like that. Again, the more mature cloud platforms are going to have kind of centralized control and centralized purchasing in place already. So very happy to see Autodesk is moving in that direction as well, because that kind of brings them into the fold of some of these more established platforms. But again, this is about kind of single point of access, single point of management, and really simplifying the equation. Kind of to the point of the title of this program. So something to keep in mind. As a CIO, I always made a point of doing all purchasing, all budgeting, all licensing for a couple reasons. Number one, I knew that my team didn't really want to do it, and therefore probably wasn't so interested in it to the level that I needed that to happen. I was not interested necessarily in the paperwork, but I was definitely interested in having the right outcomes and the right results as a part of all the things that we're talking about right now. So it is definitely complicated, but it is getting easier every year that goes by, and as we move to cloud services over time. Certainly Adobe has made great strides for those who have been in the industry for a while. We've gone from authentication codes on each machine that's tracked by user to, what's really nice with Creative Cloud at this point. Same thing with Microsoft. I can remember not too recently dealing with enterprise licensing agreements and trying to understand all of the SKUs and all the different types of licenses and, CAL licenses and server licenses and on and on and on. And it's just so nice now to have kind of something like, Office 365, where it takes care of a lot of the, depending on the license version that you're on, it takes care of a lot of those types of things for you now in a very simplified way, literally with a credit card. So there are definitely big improvements coming every year in terms of helping us to better manage our environments, and cloud services, mobile services are big contributors to that. Cross-functional ownership. The reason I put this in here is because I think historically or traditionally, IT has been kind of pulling the load here for new services and new capabilities, for a while. Certainly that's been kind of the historical model, but I think increasingly, especially as IT becomes more a part of the business, which it should be, increasingly integral to the business and not actually separate from the business. One of the easiest ways to think about how to accomplish that is through cross-functional partnerships. What does that mean? That means working not just with project teams and project leaders, sector leaders, but with marketing, with accounting, with finance, with other partners in the firm to drive different types of applications and services throughout the organization. And it's for all the types of reasons that you see here where that kind of makes some sense. Number one, potentially you're bundling a solution rather than just dealing with one solution at a time. So that bundled solution might have more value in that it is more meaningful to more people across the organization. One quick example of that, which continues to surprise me today as I think about it, but one of the projects I did at a previous firm was something as simple as a cloud-based email signature creator, which you might not think that would be a big impact item. But what you have to know is kind of the story behind the story. So at the time, the reason that came around as a potential initiative was, we were growing through merger and acquisition. We had a bunch of different brands that we had to maintain. When you bring in a partner firm or somebody joins you or you join somebody else, there's a certain time period where you need to maintain your old name, right? So that you don't lose your customer base. You have an opportunity to bring your customer base forward with you into that new type of organization, which means, you have multiple types of email signatures, just as a very simple example. Different companies have different cultures. They call people different things, whether they're designers or architects or interior designers or spec writers or whatever it happens to be. Those are the types of things that show up on signatures as well. So long story short, that became what started off as a very simple technical exercise for IT actually became a very meaningful cross-functional initiative across the firm. Because if you think about it, it involves branding, so marketing is involved, graphics as well, right? We wanted to have an ability to stamp every single email signature every single time perfectly, right? Which is what a cloud-based email signature creator can do. We wanted the ability to have that done across all devices, not just from Outlook on your desktop or from Outlook on your iPad or from the generic email system on your iPad, right? We wanted it to happen without user intervention, which is the centralized nature of it, which made that possible. But also legal was involved, right? From a title standpoint, right? An architect should be an architect everywhere, right? If the person is actually registered, as an example, and you want to make sure that those types of designations are accurate and complete. And finally, email, obviously physical addresses would change and people would be promoted and their position would change, and you wanted to make sure all of that was right. So once this thing was set up, you had literally 3 or 4 different cross-functional groups that were charged with, you had different levels of that organizational structure or that governance structure that made that system work. But in reality, once that was set up, from an IT standpoint, it was like a 3-minute change to edit somebody's address or a group's address. Say the whole office moves to a different office location and their address had to change, right? You could do that as a collection of changes, or not a collection of changes, but a group that gets changed all at the same time. So there's sort of some really secret sauce in the details here if you really think about how some of these very simple solutions can have really big impacts. And from our standpoint, we were producing 20,000 emails a day, probably going outside of the firm. And so from a marketing standpoint, the other benefit and the other value proposition that I proposed was, okay, now that we have the framework in place and we can change this easily, the next time we win an award, let's just plug that onto every email signature that goes out. So all of a sudden it becomes kind of a lightweight campaign and demand generation tool as well. This is very easy to manage. It's cloud service, centrally located, the framework's in place, it's typing in a sentence or maybe editing a little bit of graphical information, and you're done, and it just manages itself at that point. So yeah, think about those types of things in cross-functional ownership. It might have to do with how you visualize data out of finance to produce business projections or workforce projections or something like that. There's a lot of different ways that IT can plug in and become real partners and advisors across the organization to make things noticeably better for everybody. Clear execution and integrated workflow. So how can you make my services easy to use? Well, certainly cloud services offers an ability to be less disruptive and more scalable. I think that's pretty clear. But also, people maybe don't think so much about it being a self-service application, which from an empowerment standpoint for project teams and different people within the organization, that's actually a pretty huge thing, especially if you can provide self-service when you're on-prem in the office, the same as if you're off-prem, the same as if you're on your your mobile device versus your tablet versus your Surface versus whatever device you happen to be using. You should think about projecting, especially in a cloud and mobile environment. You want to think about taking the information to where they live and where they're using whatever device they happen to be using, and not just for internal users, by the way. Once you sort of master that with internal users, who's to say you don't use that to project out to your customers and your clients and your partners as well, because it's the exact same capability at that point. Named user licensing, I think, is actually pretty huge. Again, that's something that Autodesk is actually introducing with premium. Well, they're introducing it over time here away from multi-user licensing, but that kind of brings into the fold this notion that wherever I can log into, again, I keep using the same big providers that I'm most familiar with in our industry, but if it's Microsoft or it's Google or if it's Adobe or whoever it is, Autodesk, the idea of named user licensing means I can go to any machine, basically, that can run the apps, and I can log in, and all of a sudden that machine inherits my license under my name, and I can actually use it. So there's no more sort of chasing down, am I connected to the floating license server or multi-user license of some sort that might be on the on-prem system. Anyhow, it's a very powerful idea when you get to this notion of, really being able to say, I don't kind of care what device you're using or where you're accessing it from and what time of day. That becomes a very empowering idea for your entire workforce. So, and that actually becomes a more simplified idea for those who have to manage the environment as well. Training and input, I think input from teams is actually really important, from project teams and from users across the business. Again, these are really your partners. I know a lot of people still think of it as sort of them being your customers to some degree, which certainly the way that you treat them might be done in a customer kind of centric way, I guess, but increasingly they are more partners than they are customers. I would say the customer is really the person that's paying the firm to do the project work at the end of the day. But you hear different people talk about it in different ways, but it comes down to how do you create that ongoing interaction and exchange so that there's good input and good feedback on different solutions that you might be thinking about or working on. It's really a collaborative effort. You know, the problems that we're trying to solve these days, you know, it's more often than not, it's not something that probably one person is going to be able to solve on their own, right? They're actually pretty complicated problems that they have multiple dimensions to them. And so these types of capabilities, whether it's Teams or Slack or SharePoint or Google Workspaces, or knowledge architecture is another good one in terms of like a knowledge management environment. And then even just simple forms and surveys. You know, those all can contribute, but you know, you want to try to gain, again, centralized, manageable, not managed necessarily, but manageable platforms in place that allow you, you know, that make people want to collaborate, right? And often the secret there is maybe not so much the core technology in my experience, but it's having the right curators involved from certain topics that are going to help to drive the conversation, give ideas to that group that might be, you know, you might have a group that's, you know, Microsoft Teams that's focused on spec writing, right? Well, you probably want to have an owner of that group, or I think of it as a curator of that group that really tries to drive that conversation on a daily basis. Otherwise, you know, the alternative might be that it just stalls after it kind of lives out its sort of initial lure, but people will stick around if there's actually a reason to stick around, and if the information is good and useful, then it'll take on a life of its own and start to drive itself. But the opposite will be true if the information is just not good or not useful, people won't use it. So just-in-time training, I think you're starting to see an increase in that type of an idea where, you know, it's better to take training in small bites. I'm definitely a big proponent of this. You know, I try to learn something new every day. Frankly, I take a half hour of my day and try to read something or learn something or watch a webinar that I've been trying to watch. Or to me, that works better than sitting in a room or listening to somebody talk for 4 hours or 8 hours. I mean, it all depends. If you're going to do the longer training, then it's important to put it into use right away. If there's kind of a big gap between the training and when people get to execute, you know, or use what they've learned, then they're not going to be able to. They probably won't retain as much as you would like them to retain. So, and then of course, recent years we've seen a lot of sort of internal competitions and hackathons and different things that different programs that you could use internally to drive kind of innovation and kind of forward-looking initiatives. You know, kind of thinking out of the box type of initiatives. So, you know, what the right fit and mix is for you, you know, it comes down to your culture, you know, as well as how you execute, how you design and execute these types of programs. If you just kind of throw it out there and say good luck and people don't know what it is, then, you know, it's going to be kind of rough going, I think. Versus if you take a little extra time, and I would say this with all rollouts of IT, if you take a little bit of extra time and actually design it as and maybe this is my years at Autodesk talking as a product marketing manager, but if you take a little bit of time to kind of think about what's going to be useful to somebody about that product or service in their day-to-day activities, I think you're going to have a better chance, and you package it like that, I think you're going to have a better chance of getting some traction. You know, if you think about it, like with something like Revit, right? Developers are improving hundreds of things in Revit on normal release cycles, but you can't talk about hundreds of things in the documents that you put out to the population about the next version of Revit. You have to kind of pick your battles and think, well, what are the things that people are going to really care about? What are the greatest pain points that this resolves, right? So I think that's very much the same in the case of internal IT, except we have a bunch of applications and services and platforms to deal with, which is the challenge. But again, back to the bundling, that's where bundling comes in, and it starts to kind of carve down that effort a little bit. But anytime that I think you can map your initiatives and technology initiatives to the business, all the better, frankly. And that's hard. It's hard work to do that. You have to really kind of think about it a little bit, maybe talk to a bunch of people internally that are approaching things from a slightly different viewpoint or vantage point than yourself. But it's definitely, I think it's definitely worthwhile to do, to work towards that. Finally, fast, reliable support and delivery. In IT, you're always kind of, your schedule unfolds as soon as you walk in the door, generally speaking. We all know that. I know that. Certainly you know that. So the challenge is to really kind of get your focus right and try to make sure that you really stomp out recurring issues as fast as possible, right? So you don't get 50 support tickets about the same issue that you just can't find time to fix, right? So that's certainly kind of low-hanging fruit. Just being fast and responsive, I think, goes a long way, even if you don't know the answer. Often in my own teams, I would have, especially some of the younger folks in the team, they would get kind of stressed out that they just wouldn't know answers to some of the more complicated problems. And I would just say to them, it's like, I don't know is a valid answer as long as you say, well, but I'll try to find out, right? I don't think anybody can know everything, especially these days. But it's important to be very communicative and very responsive so that people know that you're not ignoring them and are actually working on their problem, and you give them updates. So I kind of think about what I always strived for was, maybe this is a bad example, but a response time that was kind of similar to if I were calling like, a utility company, or if I'm out of power and I'm calling the utility company, well, you want to know kind of on a fairly regular basis, are they even looking at it? Are they working on it? Do I see trucks out on the road? Is there some indication that you're not being ignored, that there's hope down the road of a resolution to your problem? There's those types of aspects, I think, that kind of resonate with people if you can kind of close those gaps. Visible business value, right? It's kind of harkens back to some of the previous points, but I would really just try to package the types of things that you're doing in a business context whenever you can, just because that's where people outside of IT are living, especially if they're in project teams or in the leadership groups or wherever they happen to be, right? They kind of talk a little different language. So, what I would try to do, I actually started doing this the last couple years, but increasingly I would start to build proof of concepts before I would introduce a new project initiative, just because for the very simple reason that that's what the practice folks in our group would do when they were chasing projects on their own, right? If they were going out to win a new laboratory building, they were taking the program and the input information from the client, and they were essentially designing the building. It was very high level design, but they were proposing a building that fit those requirements, right, in order to win the project. It's not that that was going to be the solution that got built, but it was enough of the solution that shows that you can build a handsome building, right, that fits all the requirements, that meets everything that they're looking for, and hopefully you win the job, and then you kind of refine it from there. So I actually started taking that same approach on projects that I would introduce, whether it was, dashboarding projects or, different types of discipline-specific data, data projects, things like that. I would try to do really, fairly quick proof of concepts to get the idea out there, so that I didn't have to describe kind of the pieces and parts of the technologies that were required to make it happen, right? Because nobody really wants to hear about SharePoint and network speed and wide area network speed and firewalls and all that. They don't want to know that. They want to know what's in it that's going to make projects bigger, better, faster, right? That's going to make the teams happier, more satisfied, make the clients want to buy more services from us, right? Those types of things. So anyhow, for what it's worth, that became kind of an ongoing tactic or approach that I would start to take, and I'm continuing that even today at Microdesk as we're looking at new types of capabilities and services within the CIO group. So On that note, I know we're kind of running at the end of the hour here, and maybe we can, if there are any questions, I'm happy to try to field them. If I don't know the answers, we'll have your email address and I can certainly research it and drop you an email afterwards. But we'll give you a second to offer any questions you might have.
Yeah, just a quick reminder to ask any questions in the questions box on your GoToWebinar control panel.
As you're thinking about the questions, the other thing that I was talking to Senny about was the idea that if this is an interesting kind of, tell me if this is kind of an interesting idea that we would have maybe once every other month, let's say, you know, kind of an open roundtable, not necessarily a webinar, but if people were interested in certain topics and getting together, you know, through an online, you know, meeting of sorts, you know, to talk about different IT topics, you know, we'd be interested to know if that sounds like a good idea to you guys, and if so, what kinds of topics would you be interested in? Certainly when I was on the CIO side, inside of business, inside of on the practice side, you know, I was involved in large firm roundtable, you know, the CIO large firm roundtable and different local IT groups, and I'm still involved in some of those, but some of the others I'm no longer able to join because I'm not on the practice side. But those are valuable, right? Because it's just an opportunity. You take an hour every month or two and you kind of compare notes on, you know, whatever the topic of the day is. It might be security one day, it might be you know, data analysis or different types of solutions another day. So if there's any interest in that, please ping us, and you know, we'll see what we can do to put something like that together. I think it's actually pretty interesting over time. So no questions?
Doesn't seem like there are any questions.
Everybody wants to get back to their normal day. Is there a normal?
Right, exactly.
In any case, I appreciate everybody's attention and
yeah,
for joining the webinar. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, folks. And if you do end up having questions after the webinar, please feel free to reach out to us on our website, give us a call or email us. We'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions after the webinar as well. And just a quick reminder that this webinar will be uploaded, or the recording of this webinar will be uploaded on our YouTube and website within a few days. So you'll get an email once that's ready. But if there are no questions, folks, please have a great rest of your day and a safe rest of your week as well. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.